A blaze of satisfaction drove away her fear. Pandemonium was a notorious high-stakes hell, and a man with Penhurst's reputation for failing to honour his vows could not expect to gamble there on credit. If he had managed to scrape together some sum of money in preparation for tonight, he must have it somewhere about his person. Of course, a fat purse could never make up for what Betty had suffered and would suffer, but even a thin one would satisfy the girl's immediate needs better than the pocket watch Lady Sterling had come to find. Pleased by the additional prospect of bankrupting him, she did not even flinch when the Baron's arm circled her waist to urge her along the shadowy path, and his brandy-soaked breath wafted over her skin.
"I've got a busy night ahead of me," he said, "but I'll give you 6pence for a quick spit and polish, dove."
Bile rose in her throat, but she swallowed it back. She had never yet had to make good on what men seemed to regard as the promise of her courtesan's garb. Tonight would be no different. Unlike Lord Penhurst, she was clever, perfectly sober, and armed. Fearing nothing so much as injustice, she turned and ran a palm over his fitted silk waistcoat, deftly snatching his watch as she passed. Even as she seemed to lavish her attention on him, her eyes were focused on that promising bulge lower down, the purse his friend ought to have advised him to guard. Her eager fingers drifted to his waist.
"Oh, Gov, me mouth's already watering."
It was not, but her eyes were. Why did gentlemen prefer dousing themselves in cologne to a thorough application of soap and water? Holding her breath, she leaned closer, clinging to him, curling her fingers against his chest, tracing the decorative stitching on his waistcoat. As she had suspected, the purse was hooked to his clothes, probably by a loop of thread over a hidden button, so it couldn't easily be lifted by a pickpocket. Nevertheless, she managed to dislodge it when she pressed closer still and wrapped her arms around him. Though they were only just off the gravel path, hardly out of sight of passers-by, his hand settled heavily on her shoulders, urging her toward the ground. Her body slid over his, obligingly, sensuously. By the time she was face to face with the front of his satin breeches, the purse was sagging free, visible below the hem of his waistcoat. He gripped the back of her neck as she knelt before him.
"That's it. I do like the sight of a girl on her knees."
That much Betty had already made clear. Fighting the impulse to deal the man more than a pecuniary injury, she spread one hand over his thigh and dug her fingertips into his flesh. He hissed and tipped back his head in anticipatory pleasure. Now, while he wasn't looking, she made her most important move, leaving her calling card where the watch had been. A necessary risk. Men, all men as far as she could tell, but most especially ones like Lord Penhurst, were presumptuous, avaricious, creatures of their appetites, yet sure of their superiority over the so-called weaker sex. She wanted them to know the identity of the woman who had bested them, wanted them to understand who held their secrets and their futures in the palm of her hand. Thanks to the reputation she had built, a simple rectangle of stiffened paper bearing the name Lady Sterling had the power to ensure that a man would think twice before continuing to tally victims. With nimble fingers, she tucked the card into the slit pocket of his waistcoat, while with the other hand she pretended to fumble with the buttons of his fall as she slipped the purse from its hiding spot. When the little leather pouch landed on the damp leaves beside her, the weighty chink of coins was the blessed music of reassurance. Betty and her child would not be condemned to starve. Penhurst froze, tightening his hand against the back of her skull. For a moment she thought he too had heard the sound of his purse hitting the ground. But no, his attention had been caught by another noise entirely. Footsteps. Someone strolling along the path, coming from the opposite direction. The perfect distraction. Luck was definitely on her side tonight. She would not have to resort to her weapon to get free. Surreptitiously, she danced the fingers of her free hand over the dirt until she found the little leather pouch, and then drew back her head against the Baron's hand, intending to...